So the whole point of reconciliation is to identify the relationships between elements in the architecture and make sure that I document those appropriately, look for interfaces between them, look for structures, constraints, and then if there are any additional options.
Welcome to Digital Transformation Architect, architecting the future of digital transformation. I'm Dr. Darren, and this podcast is for leaders navigating the real-world complexity of modern change. Each week, we cut through the hype to explore how strategy, architecture, technology, and people come together across artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, data, edge, and modern infrastructure. This isn't about chasing tools. It's about designing systems that endure. Let's get started.
Okay, in this lecture, we're going to talk about Forge, the find, observe, reconcile, ground, and enhance. And today we're going to specifically focus on reconciling and grounding the strategy in reality. So the most important thing here is that when we go through the Forge process, that we do that iterative part of the find and observe. And then once we've done that a couple of times and we iterate, now we work on that reconcile and ground. Now that iteration that we do in that Forge arc that we call it, that iteration can happen at any time, from find to observe back to find, or find, observe, reconcile back to find. And so that's one thing I want to make sure that you're highly recognize as you move this forward, right? So what we want to focus on today, though, in this lecture is the reconcile and ground. And what does that really mean? So don't forget, in the previous lecture, when we talked about find, we want to catalog all the elements and the capabilities that already exist, and we want to observe how those elements behave in real operations. That's the whole point there. When we talk about reconciliation, we want to reconcile all the things that we've already found with respect to my digital transformation. And more importantly, we want to make sure that we're aligning all those teams that we have around the architectural directions that we're moving. So this reconciliation really has to do with that relationship mapping that I have between the different elements, and it clarifies all the dependencies and all the trade-offs I need to make between them. So if I really look at reconciliation focus areas, I want to make sure that what I've described is stable across all the teams, that all the teams understand what the terms mean that I've captured and where they've been placed inside the architecture, and that find and observe areas that I've done. We also want to identify the interfaces and the seams where things are passing between departments, whether it's a process that's moving down into digital. I want to make sure that I have those interfaces well defined, and I will actually identify additional elements when I do this reconciliation. I also want to look at constraints. What cannot be violated without certain costs? Make sure that when I do have an element that is communicating with another element or is affected by another element, that I have captured that constraint, and that I have that in that relationship somehow. And then I want to look at options. Where is flexibility that I can look at, and where can I keep it in local execution, right? So if I say, well, this process requires this data or this application in the digital domain, I need to say, well, are there options to that, or is it a hardcore constraint? And what are the options? What are other things that can happen there? And I need to note those when I'm doing my reconciliation. So the whole point of reconciliation is to identify the relationships between elements in the architecture and make sure that I document those appropriately, look for interfaces between them, look for structures, constraints, and then if there are any additional options that are there for them. Okay. The other key thing that happens during reconciliation is you start unifying teams and you start identifying key roles across the teams. Who's the architect that are in the different departments? as I start pulling those departments together and they start looking at the mappings that you've done, you can start seeing some commonality. And the idea here is that we reduce friction and we improve decision making by having a common vernacular, a common way of describing certain things that are going on. And this will lead to some successes when you're reconciling efforts and bringing everything together. So the map that you do on the Open Digital Transformation Architecture, ODXA, in this reconciliation is really important and becomes a great tool for communicating between different organizations, different departments. Okay, we've talked about the relationship mapping. This is really important. In Find and Observe, it's more about capturing and dropping those elements into the maps. The relationship mapping is now when we start really identifying what the impact of maybe a strategy is on the tools that I select, or on the physical locations, on the organizational structure or the process structure. So identifying where those are. Now, ODXA has some relationships between elements already established. Those are guidelines. Those help you with you finding your own relationship mappings between systems and teams and policies and things like that. By looking at those, you can see how this process normally affects this application in the digital domain. Right? So use those relationships in the ODXA standard as kind of clues to help you find what relationships there are between your elements. Doesn't mean that they have to be, but chances are there's something there, more than likely. Okay? And then this will also surface data lineage, ownership, decision rights by identifying these relationships. It's really amazing when you start doing this. And then also, you'll also find conflicts. And there can be conflicts in these relationships between different elements. And you will find out real quickly where you might have decision bottlenecks because two people think they have the same decision authority on two different elements or two different subsystems or layers inside your architecture. So keep all that stuff in mind. All right. Another thing that you work on when you're doing reconciliation is trade-offs, right? This is a big thing. When you're prioritizing things or you're deciding what to focus on, the reconciliation part and establishing those relationships will tease out some of the trade-offs that you have to deal with, whether it's executive ambition versus operational reality. That's always a good one, right? The executives think one thing and reality is something different. Speed versus stability, central standards versus the local autonomy, short-term wins versus long-term coherence. All these trade-offs need to be documented and established inside the model, right? So that you can see what the impact of these decisions are on the architecture moving forward and when you start developing that roadmap. Okay, so when I reconcile, don't forget, there's trade-offs that I have to deal with. There's relationships that I have to deal with. There's a lot going on in reconciliation. Let's get down to the next step, which is grounding. Now, grounding is all about rooting what you've described and you've captured in reality. So grounding ties all your strategies in the strategic domain to existing resources in the other four domains, whether it's organizational resources or processes that you already have, digital resources or physical resources, right? So grounding says, all right, this is what's real. This is what is there today. And what can I leverage in those four grounding domains for my strategy and what I want to do in the future? So the idea here is instead of throwing it all out, we want to reuse as much as we possibly can. That's where the power comes in doing the grounding, right? Is I'm not going to just add more vendors to my solution. Let's see what I already have and what can be leveraged. That's the key here, right? When you're in grounding, you may identify additional relationships. Go all the way back to the find and observe, right? And then you'll find those relationships in the reconcile. So make sure that when you're grounding that you're not violating any of the relationships that you've already established. If you are, then you need to go back to reconcile and figure that out and say, is this a real relationship, or am I creating something new that really shouldn't be there? Okay, so this is where things get really interesting. Here's a grounding checklist. You need to identify which assets are durable, which ones are going to stay around and should remain, or which ones should I start ditching, right? What constraints are non-negotiable? What investments are still paying back that I've already invested in? And what dependencies must be preserved when I start doing my grounding? I've run into situations where I have a customer that is using 2 or 3 different virtualization technologies in their software-defined infrastructure layer in the digital domain. And we came up with the question, why are you using 2 or 3? You're paying more licensing than you need to. And it turns out that one of them we could get rid of, but the other 2 we couldn't because there was so much dependencies on the other 2 that I couldn't go back down to 1. But 1, there weren't as many dependencies. It was an easy lift and shift, and it saved me some extra money, right? And the other technologies that we had the capabilities that were needed for this. So this grounding checklist all has to do a lot with what do I already have? What can I get rid of? What constraints do I have? And what do I have that I can use today without going out and buying more? So when you do look at your grounding, make sure that you identify constraints, your durable assets, which ones can I get rid of, which ones are you still paying back on investments, and you need to decide, is that worth doing still, or do I need to ditch it? And make sure you identify those dependencies, which should have come from the reconciliation step, but you may identify additional ones. And then from all that, you'll come up with a grounding plan. That should easily map into your ODXA mappings, where I'm saying, this is my current situation, and this is my ground. This is where I'm stuck, right? Not stuck, that's the wrong word. This is where I'm building my foundation, is off that grounding phase that I've already established. Okay? Now, if you neglect grounding, then you go to this rip and replace. What I have seen is it's never a rip and replace. It's always I create a new silo. Then later on, you come up with a new project. So now, I got to integrate with the legacy systems, and I've got a new project that does all that, right? So rarely do I see a true blown rip and replace. And even if you do, the risk is really high. So don't do a rip and replace. Don't neglect grounding. Identify what you're going to use. Identify what you can get rid of. You're not going to get rid of everything, right? Come up with a roadmap. And this is where you start building your roadmap based off of your grounding that you've done, right? So make sure you do that. Look out for the harm on rip and replace. Rip and replace always has some impact on transformation initiatives. And so you have to watch out for that. All right. So in practice, grounding is embedded in new initiatives and existing operational rhythms. So you got to identify that. You want to favor incremental upgrades over wholesale replacement. And so this grounding is the idea here is that you identify the things that you want to reuse as much as you can, and you want to reduce risk by anchoring what already works. If something already works and is good, then don't rip it out, right? Unless you're getting rid of that whole segment of, maybe you're getting rid of a whole set of processes because it doesn't generate any value anymore. Then that's a good target. Okay, there are lots of different case studies on effective grounding techniques, which I will make available out on the website, where you can see different use cases on doing this successfully. Okay, so here's the goal here. When I do my reconciliation and I want to move it to ground, the idea here is that I take that ODXA map that I've already established in the find and observe. I put in my relationships in the reconcile. I reconcile all those relationships. Then I mark the elements for my ground. And those elements now become my grounding, my solid foundation that I'm going to now build actionable results on in the next phase, which is enhance, right? Do I need to enhance? Do I need to add anything in order to get the new value coming out that's coming from the strategy? So this handoff prevents strategy from floating above reality because I'm tying everything back up into that value stream that I've established in my strategy as I move it all the way down. So that's the goal of this exercise. On the grounding is this is my foundation that I'm building on. Do I get true value out of my current grounding? The answer is yes. You already do get value out of it because your organization's already running. What additional value do I get out of it? That's when we move to what we'll talk about in the next lecture, which is enhance. And the key here, I want everyone to recognize, when I talk about grounding, grounding applies to all 4 of the lower domains. It also applies to strategic, right? What strategy am I going to ground in? But specifically in organizational structure. Am I going to stay? My structure is going to stay the same? Are my skills going to stay? What skills do I already have that I want to leverage? What values do I have? What personas? All those things. See, organizational has that grounding. Digital processes. What processes am I going to reuse? Not change. I'm going to stick with these processes. What applications? Which middleware technology? Which security aspects and identity? What data am I grounding all this in? That's in the digital domain. In the physical domain, physically, what machines am I using? What devices am I using? What locations am I going to stick with? Which locations am I going to shed off? This all fits into this whole concept of the grounding, right? So it's important to label your grounding. Okay, and we've talked about the enhance part. That's the next step that we'll talk about in the next lecture. So go out there and keep working on this. And in the Forge process, don't forget, find, observe, reconcile, ground, enhance. Okay? Find, observe, reconcile, ground, enhance. And next week we'll talk about the enhance and how I move forward with execution on that.
You've been listening to Digital Transformation Architect. If today's discussion helped you see your challenges more clearly, the next step is to apply architecture, not just technology. For deeper conversations with leaders and practitioners shaping real change, listen to Embracing Digital Transformation or check out our website at embracingdigital.org. Until next time, architect the future with intent.